I think the audio is off here. Okay, there we go. So before we can begin, just share something that Robert just shared with me, which is a very nice reading of yesterday's Gemara. So we're discussing the speech that Yeshua gives and says to the Jewish people that if you don't accept the mission to the mandate of inheriting the land, here the river will drown you. And we explained, we interpreted it yesterday to mean that they were experiencing some sort of spiritual ecstasy, and they're being told this whole point is to make sure you go into the land and inherit it, not just to get lost, as it were, to drown yourself in the ecstasy. So to add to that, Robert was comparing this to the mountain that the Gemara says God held over the Jewish people's head and said, if you accept the Torah, good. If not, here's your burial. As if to say, before the Jewish people take on any insurmountable responsibility, God has to give them that push. And in that push, it kind of takes away their free choice, buried or drowned. And both of which, well, certainly when it comes to the mountain, Chassidus straight out explains that this is an expression of Hashem's love. And the idea of the mountain is Hashem is so overwhelmingly loving that how could you possibly say no? So the choice is taken away from them. So perhaps there's a similar thing here. When the river splits and there's such a divine revelation, how do you say no? You have to say yes. That I thought was very nice.
But the whole goal of all this is to get into Israel.
Right. That's what he's telling them.
Change their minds when they're crossing the Jordan.
Well, many people wanted to stay in the desert, including the spies, which we're going to talk about soon.
But that was for different reasons. They knew that in the desert that they lived the life of glory.
Exactly. So imagine the life of glory where Hashem is holding up rivers for you. Is that not glory?
Yeah,
I think it's the same point, which is why I think that the Gemara is going to go from here and segues into the spies. The connection between yesterday's discussion and the spies, as we're going to see in a moment, at least on the surface level, is just on the question of the size of the rocks, which we're going to discuss in a moment, the stones that they had to move with a monument, and comparing that size to the size of the fruit that they carried. And then from there, the Gemara segues into the discussion on the spies. And perhaps the link between the two events, the crossing of the river and the spies, is that both made the same root mistake. Or better yet, the people across the river did not make the mistake that the spies made. The spies made a mistake of saying, forget the land of Israel, it's too difficult, it's too hard, it's too overwhelming. Let's stay in the desert where we have God's manna and we're having a spiritual, fantasy, beautiful life. Whereas the people who crossed the river, notwithstanding the fact that they were in the river and had that spiritual revelation, they took the stones and anchored it and put it into Israel to continue going and doing their mission. So the people across the river, so to speak, fixed the mistake of the spies. Thus the link, right? Because the people in the river didn't fail like the spies did. The spies went to Israel and said, too difficult, this whole Israel project, stay in the desert, much better. And when they're crossing the river, Yeshua says, this is the last major revelation before you enter into your serious work. Take stones and anchor it in the land of Israel so that you get the job done, not just get lost in spiritual ecstasy. Unlike the spies who made the mistake of thinking they want to lose themselves in spiritual ecstasy of the desert. And did, they died in the desert. All the while having manna. Right? They want to stay in the desert for the rest of their lives. Good, they stayed in the desert for the rest of their lives with the manna, with the miracles and everything. But to fulfill God's purpose, they didn't do. Whereas the guys who crossed the desert, the river did. They took those stones from the inspiration from the river and planted it in the land of Israel, anchoring all their inspiration in their mission. So the people who crossed the river, specifically with these stones, corrected the mistake of the spies. And thus, perhaps, is really the link that the Gemara is about to make between the guys who crossed the river and the spies, and specifically related to the rocks and the fruits. As we're going to see, the fruits was an expression of the soul of the spies' mistake, and the rocks is an expression of the people who crossed the river doing the right thing. Right, so the correction is like parallel to the mistake. Right, whenever you have a correction, it's parallel to the mistake. Right, you want to counteract the mistake, yeah, it's got to be in parallel, but on the opposite end.
It wasn't a mistake.
The spies.
Plot.
Right. I mean, mistake as in like their error, their failure. Right. So when you're correcting a failure, it's got to be measure for measure, so to speak. So we're going to use literally the measure of the rock to tell us the measure of the fruits. So the fruit being a symbol of the failure of the spies, as we're going to see. So the corrective measure is the rock, the symbol of the corrective measure, where they took the rocks into the land of Israel, rather than taking fruit out of the land of Israel and saying, look how terrible this place is. It's the corrective measure. Following? Maybe that's what the link in the Gemara about to do now.
God promised them so many things. I'll fight your wars for you. This.
God fighting.
What else do you want?
They want mana. They want mana. Spiritual and physical mana, both. Okay, so let's see the Gemara. Omer Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda said, Abba Chalafta, Rabbi Lezer ben Masya, Chanina ben Chachinoi. 3 sages. Abba Chalafta, Eliezer son of Masya, Hanania son of Chachinoi. Amdu al oisei avonim. Literally, they stood at those or on those stones. They went to go check them out. Vishirum, and they measured them. They measured those stones. We're talking about the stones that the Jewish people placed, right? We said yesterday there's 2 sets of stones. There was the stones that the Jewish people took as a monument for generations to come. Another set of stones they used at the mountain of the curses and the blessings, right? And then they brought carbonas there. Well, let's see what Rashi tells us about these stones. Where is that? Rashi doesn't tell us which stones they measured. Yeah, the people took from the Jordan. Yeah. Okay, so they measured the stones people took from the Jordan. And kol achas va'achas, each and every one, shkula weighed, karbayim saw, about 40 saw. That's how heavy it was, each stone. Yeah, that's right. There's definitely significance there. And I'm definitely going to put all that on the table to see if we can come up with some good interpretation.
The second set came from the Jordan itself.
They both came from the Jordan. One came from under the feet where the people
between the mountains.
They took them from the Jordan and built them between the mountains.
Oh.
So they took 2 sets of stones, one from the Jordan to build monuments, 12, one for each tribe, from under the feet of where the Kohanim stood to build at the place where they would rest that night.
Yeah.
And then the other set of stones to build an altar, which they covered in plaster at the mountains of Gerizim and Avel. Okay, so they measured these stones, and they were about 40 saw.
It's about 400, it says here, no, about 400 kilograms.
400 kilograms, it's very heavy. Now get this. The Gemiri, now we have a tradition, we have it by our understanding, that to only the madli inish the katfe, the amount a person can carry on a shoulder, till he saw is only a third, the te'une havai. I think the havai is part of that, yeah. Third, the amount a person could carry if someone else loaded him up. So however much I can raise onto my shoulder myself, I can carry 3 times the amount if someone were to put it onto my shoulder and I just stood there. Right? Lifting weights is one amount you can take, but once you lift up that bar, people can put on much more. Right? So whatever you can lift up yourself is a third of what someone could put onto you. So which means then, this in and of itself is a lesson in life. When you carry the burden on your own, it's very difficult. But when others kind of help you in carrying the responsibility, you can do much more. Even though you carry it yourself, if someone else helped you lay it on, you have much more, you can carry much more. So if the people then carried 40 saw, and in that instance, they didn't have help, because the pasuk says that Yeshua sent one person per tribe go pick up a stone. So nobody else loaded it onto them. So which means on their own, they were capable of lifting up 40 saw, which means if someone else were to load them up, they can carry 120. If someone else were to load them up. So mikanat machashiv,
It seems interesting that they're using a volume measure because it's not a weight, it's a volume.
40 saw is a volume.
So.
Yeah,
and
good point.
Rocks are more dense than water. Just thinking of.
Yeah.
volume.
That's a good question.
Why is it measured in volume and not a weight?
Good question. We can add that into trying to understand this on a deeper level, but yes, definitely.
Could be to show you how large the rocks were.
Right, but we're talking about the weight.
Different measure.
It's a different measure. Unless it means in size. I can carry more in size if someone carries it onto me than if I lift it myself. That's also possible. Maybe it literally means in volume. But 40 you saw volume.
It's not water, that's the
Area.
big tank.
That's a big,
Area.
right,
Yeah.
right, but a big, a 40 saw of stone in volume is what is it, 3 amas by an amma or something like that?
It's about, it's 400, around 400 kilograms.
That's weight. That's not
No, I
a.
know,
That's
I know.
not a.
It's telling you what the equivalent is for those stones.
Right. Anyway, let's see. So if that's the case, then if someone loaded them up, they can carry 120. So mekanat machashiv, from here you can calculate laeshko to how big the grapes that the people brought back from the land of Israel. So when the spies went to Israel, they came back with grapes, figs, pomegranates, one of each, which we'll discuss in a moment. Or one cluster of grapes, let's say. Eshkol is a cluster of grapes. And they brought them back to demonstrate, as we're going to see soon, that Israel is a land too difficult to inhabit. They show the people, do you see the size of these fruits? It's insane. The kinds of people who can live on these kinds of fruits, not the kinds of people we want to start up with. That's essentially what the people were saying.
I said to them, but your words for you. 10 guys could be 1,000.
Let's see more of the Gemara's commentary. Maybe we'll unpack. Maybe we'll get to unpack a little bit more as we go through. We're going to see the Gemara's commentary on the story and we'll unpack a little bit. Okay, so that was the point. I want to demonstrate how strange and this land is. That look at the kind of fruit it produces. And then for the people that live there, just as unpredictable as these fruits, just out of the ordinary. So if each person can carry 120 saw when it's loaded onto their back, right? Then let's figure out how heavy this cluster of grapes was. The verse reads, "Vayisu b'moit b'shnayim." The spies carried the cluster on pole with 2, literally translated. So says the Gemara, from the fact that the pasuk says they used a pole to carry the cluster. Do I not know that there's already 2 carrying it because there's a pole? So why then would the verse have to say 2? They carry it with pole with 2. So therefore we must say the 2 is not telling you 2 people, but b'shnei moitos, 2 poles, which means 4 people. Now let's assume that they helped each other lift it up. And each can carry 120. And there's 4 people. So we have 120 times 4 is what? 480. So 480 saw is the size of this cluster of grapes. Pretty wild.
Lots of wine.
Lots of wine.
At least one say.
Maybe that's where they wanted to be in the desert for 40 years. It's like we got enough for 40 years to go, or we don't need to go anywhere. Okay. So 480 saw of cluster of grapes. You have 4 people carrying. Rabbi Yitzchak says it wasn't just 4 people, because it wasn't just 4 poles. It was Torni. I'm not sure how to pronounce this word. Tortani. See how you pronounce it. Tortane. So it's like a tortane. You had poles. The tortane did tortane, and you had poles to hold up the poles. So there's different ways of reading it, and Rashi reads it like a crisscross. 2 poles going this way and 2 poles going that way.
There's a picture in here.
So those are different versions, right?
Scale.
Okay, they passed them here, yeah. There's different
Yeah,
versions to how it
right.
was. Rashi gives the crisscross. So
Yeah, like a mesh.
actually, Rashi doesn't do any of those.
No,
Yeah, look in the
like a mesh. Like
The poles came from both.
according to different opinions, but I don't see Rashi's opinion here. Rashi seems to say it was going like this, whereas like a crisscross, like 2 going one way and 2 going the other way, like at an angle like this. That I think is Tosfos, if I'm not mistaken, which was that way,
According to different opinions. Oh, there's three. There's three.
and neither of which is Rashi there.
Uh-huh.
They skipped the generation.
Yes, it comes down to like the Torah is not an Aramaic word, or it's not a Hebrew word, and they're trying to understand. It's coming to trying to deduce what that word means to figure out what they meant. But it certainly means 4 poles, in concluding that we're talking about 8 people. Now, if it's 8 people and each person carries 120 saw, 120 times 8 is
Oh, 480 is actually, you divide 12 stones, right?
hold on a second. Let's get there. Right? Wait.
I just did the calculation.
Well, before we get to 420, let's get to Yitzchak.
960.
960, right? 960, it's a lot of saw. It's a lot of saw. Okay, so says the Gemara, Hakate said, how did this all come down? Why is Yitzchak coming to the conclusion there's 4 people rather than the 4? I mean, the 4 that the original Gemara's view presented is derived from the verse, because the verse says, with pole with 2, implying 2 poles, 4 people. So why is Yitzchak concluding that there's 8 people? So he explains like this, because you have 12 spies, right? And you have grapefruit. I'm sorry, you have a pomegranate, a fig, and a cluster of grapes. So if then you have to account for all 12 people. So how does it all break down? Shmoina nasu eshkol echad. 8 people carried 1 cluster, as we just described. Sorry, shmoina nasu eshkol. 8 carried cluster of grapes. Echad nasar diman. 1 carried a pomegranate. Echad nasar te'ena, and 1 carried a fig. So you have now 10 people. There are 12 spies. Who are the 2 that are not part of this? No? That's right, the 2 that didn't mess up. Yeshua, V'kalev. Lo nasu klum. They didn't carry anything. And the Gemara gives 2 reasons why they didn't carry anything. Now, I'll tell you the 2 reasons, but it would seem to me that the 2 reasons are actually not just 2 variations of the same explanation on the same fact, but actually would mean that we have to understand the whole story very differently. So eBay saying, well, one reading as to why Yeshua and Kalev didn't carry anything is Mishum Nechashivi, because they were more important, they were more virtuous, they were leaders amongst the leaders.
Directors.
Yeah, and directors. And in deference to their status, they didn't carry. Now, from that reading, would you say that the people carrying these fruits are doing a bad thing or a good thing?
They were doing a bad thing.
Hold on a second. From this perspective, that the reason why Yeshua and Kalev didn't carry, meaning put aside everything you know already about the story beforehand, just taking this fact, that the reason why Yeshua and Kalev didn't carry is because of their virtue. So it would seem like it's a fantastic thing that they carried. Just Yeshua and Kalev, it's not appropriate that they should be carrying fruit, but they would have, right? But the other reading is Eboy saying, but the other reason why they didn't carry the fruit, the other version as to why they didn't carry fruit, is because they weren't part of the scheme. And the carrying of the fruits, right? But see, you're opposing your understanding, but which comes from the Gemara. But the Gemara gets 2 options, right? So, you following? The second explanation for why didn't Yeshua and Kalev carry the fruits? 2 answers. Answer A, because they're too virtuous. That's why they didn't carry. Meaning they would have carried, but it's beneath their status to carry. Almost sounding as if the carrying the fruit was a good thing. Hold on 1 second. We don't get to agree and disagree with the Gemara. We get to listen and learn and hear what the Gemara has to say. We don't get to vote. We don't get that vote. Right? We can argue about what the Gemara means, yes. but not whether we like one opinion in the Gemara or the other, right? Okay, now the second answer in the Gemara is that the reason why Yeshua and Caleb didn't carry is because they weren't part of the scheme, because the fruit itself was the scheme. The scheme was, as I mentioned earlier, to demonstrate, you see how wild this country is, there's massive fruit. It's the kinds of people who eat this kind of fruit. It's not the kind of people you want to start up with. So Yeshua and Caleb said we want a part of this. So it's two opposite interpretations in the Gemara. One is, that the fruit, bringing the fruit to the desert was part of the scheme to show the people. Do you see how crazy these fruits are? The kinds of people who live on these kinds of fruit are not the kind of people we want to start up with.
Like, here, look at this.
Yeah, this was a way to scare the people. And Yeshua and Caleb said, we want no part of this. That's the second interpretation. But the first interpretation is the reason they didn't carry is because of their virtue, their status. Almost as if, yeah, it would have been nice to carry those fruit in, but they didn't. Right? Which I'll explain why why they are actually, even though they seem opposite, they're actually both sides of the same coin. Because bringing this amazing fruit, if you have faith in Hashem, that Hashem is going to lead you in battle and you'll be successful, then these amazing fruit just demonstrate the virtue of the blessing. On the other hand, if you're not trusting in Hashem and you think you're battling on your own, then these crazy fruit scare you. So the same fruit can be a source of blessing to everybody or a source of fright.
Maybe they were the ones that were on the tail end of assisting the other ones that had the load by the end.
The Gemara doesn't say that. Let's go with the second interpretation. If the reason why Yeshua and Caleb didn't carry the fruit is because they weren't part of the scheme, and they wouldn't help them load up, they want no part of it. Even according to the first interpretation, that it's beneath their status to be carrying fruit. And it's also beneath their status to be helping them with the fruit. Get someone else to help you. Either way, they wouldn't have been helping them. But
those people are not like that.
Who?
The two that didn't carry.
Yeshua and Caleb,
it's not, I'm above you guys, I'm not carrying.
It's not about being above them, but it's about respecting the position. There is such a thing, which is like there's halacha about what a rabbi should do and shouldn't do.
I think they smell the dirty blood.
There's two versions of the Gemara. We have to accept and understand both, right? We don't get to choose one, we have to accept both. But the other reason the Gemara is that there were two, it was beneath, there is halacha, for example, about certain things a rabbi cannot do. He cannot dress like, he has to dress properly, not because of who he is, because of the position. He represents the position of the rabbinate, and he has to behave accordingly. So Yeshua and Caleb, likewise, they present a certain position, and they should not be carrying things. Like the high priest, like a king. There's all kinds of laws of someone who has to maintain, not because of his status, but because of the position he holds. So considering the position Yeshua and Caleb hold, it would be inappropriate for them to carry fruit. But they don't think it's a bad thing per se in that reading. And I'm suggesting that they're two sides of the same coin. Bringing back the amazing fruit of Israel is either inspiring the people, wow, look where we're going, or scary to the people. And those are the two versions of the Gemara here. Maybe.
So,
right?
Sorry.
Yeah.
Rashi has 10 people carrying.
The Gemara does this.
Because I'm seeing in this picture, on all these three opinions.
No, but there's fruit. There's one on pomegranate.
This is the stone.
That's only the grapes. The grapes are 8, but then you have one on the pomegranate and one on the fig.
Okay, right, you're right.
Right, so you have 10 total there. Right, there's 3 items carried.
Okay.
Yeah.
To take the pomegranate later, they could have taken it all.
So now let's think about this a little deeper. There's a lot to think about. There's what you mentioned, Robert, which is the fact that the first opinion, which says that the grapes are 480, is exactly the measure of how many stones, 120, right? Because you have 40 saw of stone times 12, right?
Yeah, that's 480.
480, which is the exact size of the grapes, even though the next opinion would say it's 960, because you had 8 people carrying, right? But that's still interesting to note. It's also interesting to note that it's 40 saw to begin with, equal to the measure of mikvah. Interesting to note. Another interesting thing to note is, and this is something that really is getting my curiosity, is when it came to the stone, Hashem instructs that how do we get from 40 to 120? Because they measured the stones as 120, as 40, right? And they understood that each person lifted the stone on their own in conjunction with God's command. When it came to the spies, we assume that they each helped each other lift it up. So it's such a strange phenomenon. When it comes to the stones, they're taking it themselves. When it comes to the fruit, the spies are helping each other. Wouldn't it be the opposite? Something, I'm just saying, telling you these are things that are making me think. When they're going to the land of Israel, they're doing this beautiful, positive thing. That's what you would imagine they'd be helping each other carry. But then it's not that like that in the Gemara.
Oh, maybe it's just logistically. In the water,
Yeah,
there's buoyancy. It's easier
they're not in the water.
Not from the
to. Oh,
current.
it's
The-
not-
the water
it's not
stops,
in-
right?
The water is already.
It's inside the river, yes, but the water stopped already.
Uh-huh. There's no water at all.
No, that's right. Yeah,
There's just
there's a dam that's being blocked. That's right. They're taking it from dry land.
Throw that out.
Yeah. So I just wondering on the messaging level, what's the message here? The stone they're carrying on their own, but the fruit they're doing, they're sharing the responsibility, helping each other. What's going on here? I don't know the answer. I'm just
Grapes are on vines. They don't have to lift from the ground. But that would be the reverse then. It would be easier.
right.
Be easier.
Yeah.
He's saying you could back up into a grape.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, especially if it pulls through and then they help each other lift it up, right? It's just an interesting phenomenon that when it comes to like the negative, they're helping each other. When it comes to the positive, they're not helping each other. I'm wondering what that means.
We're looking forward to the Chazorah tomorrow.
I don't know. I'm the thing that comes to my mind is it's just the first thought. I'm not sure. Which maybe when it comes to, I don't know. Maybe when it comes to like, you can help someone else carry their load, but don't help someone else load up his load. You know, something along those lines. Like someone else is carrying a heavy burden, help them. But don't start piling onto them extra burden.
Don't add to their burden.
Don't add to their burden. I don't know, something like that. Because in other words, if they would help each other by the stone, they'd end up each carrying more.
Right.
So make it harder for each other. They're helping for each other would be making it harder for each other. Almost like just because it's right and good, it doesn't mean you have to impose it on someone else. So make the other guy carry more because it's a good thing. So instead of him carrying 40, I'm going to push onto him 120. Maybe something like that. Whereas when it comes to like the negative, they're each egging each other on to behave negatively. I don't know, maybe. I'm just, these are fragmented thoughts a little bit, but that's what I'm thinking. Yeah.
Stones,
Didn't read
you
everything.
can pick up 40, and put it on your shoulders.
But if they help each other, they get 120.
It
But
says they.
120, you have to stand up and keep the foot on.
That's what I'm saying. So I'm suggesting that maybe the reason why they didn't help each other in the carrying the stones is because when you're doing a pot, in other words, let's put it this way: the guys going into the land of Israel through the river carrying the rocks. That's the story of the positive trajectory, right? The people carrying the fruit from the land of Israel into the desert. That's the trajectory of negativity. So why is it then the trajectory of positivity, people are carrying alone, and when it comes to the trajectory of negative, they're carrying together? So it's funny. Shouldn't it be the reverse? Shouldn't you think that when people are doing good things, they help each other, and they're doing negative, they're all selfish? Isn't that ordinarily how you think? So I'm suggesting that maybe on the positive trajectory, the lesson here is just because it's a good thing, it doesn't mean you have to make someone else work harder. You know, people get it into their heads that, you know, a certain project is a good project. And because I think it's a good project and it's legitimately a good project, therefore I'm going to force everybody else to follow me in my project. You don't have to make other people carry your own burden. You have to push on everybody else that they should be carrying more. And again, it's a fragmented thought, but maybe. What were we going to say, Robert? Do you want to say something? Sorry.
I just didn't. Where it says in the Gemara that the spies were helped by they helped each other with the fruit.
It doesn't say so explicitly, but that's the Gemara's implication, because the Gemara is timesing whatever weight of the stone is, it's timesing that by 3 for the people carrying the fruit because they're helping each other.
Oh, okay, I got it. All right.
Right? How is the Gemara timesing getting to 3
That's
times
the inference, yeah.
that they're helping each other? Right? Because a person can carry 3 times the amount if someone were to load it on.
Okay.
So in the desert, in the fruit, They loaded it onto each
You
other.
had 3 times the.
At least the grapes, they helped each other. Doesn't say anything about their pomegranate and the fig. But certainly the grapes they did. So therefore they can carry 3 times the weight. Each person carrying 120 so. Following?
If you look at it another way.
Well, yeah, what do you say?
Carrying the rocks out of the river, this is what God probably helped them. Right? Because they're doing something positive.
Right, but okay, yeah, let's say that that's the case, yeah.
Here they're doing something negative as far as God is concerned. So he's making it harder for them.
But then the calculation wouldn't add up. Because the calculation is that they carried 40 of rock on their own, so they carried 120 of fruit because they helped each other, which means all else being equal. So we can't assume that God helped them more here than there, otherwise the measure would be imbalanced. If the measure is equal, except for the fact that they were helping each other versus not, all else has to be equal, right? So I'm not sure, I'm just throwing this out there. But what I did think about is and I'll close with this thought, which is the 2 sides of the coin of Yeshua and Kalev, either not carrying because it was unbecoming of their status, but really it's a good thing, or they didn't do it because it's a negative and they didn't want to be part of that negative, right? The two. So maybe it's something like this. They're going into the land of Israel and they're taking on the challenge of making the world a home for Hashem, right? Because they're leaving the cocoon of the desert and they're going into the land of Israel. They have to work the land, right?
The slaves are the 12 people.
We're talking about the Jewish people before they're entering the land of Israel, right? Let's go a little, just back up a second. The people crossing the desert are actually going to Israel. The spies are trying to stop them from going to the land of Israel, right? So they're the exact inverse of each other, right? So the people crossing the river are the correction to the spies, because the spies are trying to stop the land of Israel, right? So if the struggle here is, we're going into the land of Israel, we're leaving the cocoon of the spiritual cocoon of the desert with the manna and all the beautiful things, and we're going to the land of Israel, we've got to work the land, we've got to fight wars, we have to deal with even infighting. The spies are, the tribes end up infighting after they get into the land of Israel. We're fighting Philistines. It's going to be work, right? So when you come back with the big fruit, right? The fruit, so to speak, is the product of your labor, right? So it's either inspiring, you see all the work you're going to be put in yields unbelievable fruit, so it's totally worth all the effort. Or do you see the size of the goal? It is way too much to handle. Forget it, it's not worth it. It's too difficult.
Are we putting in juxtaposition when they entered?
That's
both
right.
times, right?
That's right. The Gemara is comparing the carrying of the rocks to the carrying of the fruit, which are the exact opposite, because the carrying of the fruit is going into the land of Israel, whereas the carrying of the fruit is trying to stop them from going into the land of Israel. That's why I'm saying that they're
They had a heavier load to bear if it's only 10.
Going in, yeah, that's still have to.
it's say it again.
Saying there were only 10 spies that were carrying.
There was 12 and 12 both times. Going into the land of Israel, carrying the rock is 12 people, and spies were also 12 people. 10 messed up, but there's 12 spies, right? 2 of which came back.
They had 2 less for carrying the fruits.
Right. So why?
But I'm saying.
Why didn't those 2 carry?
More important, well, why? But why? Because of their sin, each person had to carry more per load than, right?
This is not a load Hashem puts on them. This is them carrying a load to make a point.
But they each had to carry more of a load, right? As a burden to.
You're suggesting that maybe, 1 second, you're suggesting that maybe to prove a negative, you have to carry a greater load, maybe. Maybe.
Similar, I guess, to what Alan was saying.
Maybe, yeah.
We made it harder. It was
Maybe.
harder per person. Because it's divided among 10 rather than.
Maybe. Anyways, just suggesting that the Yeshua and Kalev dynamic, about whether it's a good thing to bring the fruit back or not a good thing to bring the fruit back, right?
Right.
The Gemara gives 2 explanations why Yeshua and Kalev didn't carry the fruit, either because carrying the fruit is a bad and they didn't want to be part of it, or because carrying the fruit is good, but it's just beneath their dignity to do it, right? So I'm just giving 2 sides of the coin. And when you demonstrate the difficulty of a coming challenge, that's either exciting at the prospect of what we can accomplish, or it's scary, right? It's the same presentation, but it's either scary or exciting. So maybe for Yeshua and Kalev, the message is, do you see what the result of the product would be at the end? if we put the effort into serve Hashem, whereas the spies are saying it's not even worth the whole thing. The other 10 spies.
Anyway, it's very scary because if you're trying to prove a point, you say these guys, we were like ants, we were like grasshoppers compared to them.
Yeah,
You're bringing back these big fruits, and you're saying, these see this pomegranate where normally one person can eat it. That's how big those people were.
Mhm.
Pomegranate is this
Right.
size.
that's what I'm saying. You're saying how scary it is.
Yeah, it's scary.
Right, that's right. But if you believe that Hashem can take care of you, then the prospect is exciting.
That's why
Not
it's
scary.
scary.
So the same fruits could be scary or exciting depending on where you
That's
stand.
why it's scary.
Land of milk.
Right, no, that for sure, sorry.
And land of milk and honey, you see the fruit is probably how beautiful. it is.
That's right. So it's either scary or exciting.
Yeah.
Okay, the Gemara is going to go back, interestingly, make one more comment on the crossing of the river and then come back to the story of the spies. So we will get more clarity as the Gemara comments on thing, but open up more questions than answers today. Okay, wonderful day, Eden.
Nice variation here.
Yeah, this is